sexy on secular sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show that goes where no one has gone before. Joining me as always is our resident sexpert, Christy Powell.
Howdy.
And this week, I am incredibly excited to be guest hosting with Jessie Gender. Jessie's YouTube channel uses geek and pop culture to talk about social, political, and topical issues, and is part of my steady YouTube diet, especially when it comes to two of my favorite topics, gender and Star Trek. She's also been recently published in an anthology of essays called Navigating Trans and Complex Gender Identities, which she wrote with Ashley Ewell and Rhea Ashley Hoskins. Jessie, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here. It's super exciting.
Awesome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, where to start? So I am, basically you gave a really good introduction for me, but I'm a YouTuber who makes stuff about Star Trek and gender, and then trying to kind of connect the two, and also talking about science fiction, and basically trying to use science fiction and popular culture to discuss what we can learn from it, discuss how it applies to our everyday life, basically trying to discuss pop culture in a way that feels relevant to today. And then, I also write about mainly trans topics, but generally LGBTQ and sexuality topics as well, just in general, with a specific focus on trans topics. And I think that's the long and short of who I am.
That's awesome. I am so excited. We're going to get into all of that tonight. If you have geeky questions about sci-fi, pop culture, or gender identity, now's the time to give us a call and strike up a conversation. We are going to be answering our calls at our new number, 512-991-9242, starting right now. That's 512-991-9242. All right, so let's jump into the interview. Tell us about kind of why you started your channel and what the inspiration was behind the focus of it. Why talk about gender on the internet, and why include sci-fi in that discussion?
Yeah, so the channel actually came out of my time working at Pride Media. I used to work there full-time as a video producer, where they have the magazine The Advocate, Pride.com, and Out Magazine, which are sort of big LGBTQ magazines. And while I was there, I sort of realized that while I love talking about trans issues, because that was sort of the obvious focus of those magazines, I also really loved Star Trek. I mean, it's kind of this interesting thing when you come out and sort of are publicly in the LGBTQ communities. I'm sure you both know that you start off being like, I want to talk about queer issues. I want to talk about how we can push forward, representation and things like that. But then you also realize there's so many other interests that I had before I came out. I wasn't just sitting here only talking about queer issues. So I decided to make the channel because I wanted to find a place to sort of merge the two and find a way to discuss how to talk about the things that I loved. I mean, Star Trek was always the big and main one, but it wasn't just that. I wanted to talk about Marvel movies, DC Comics, which I'm a huge fan of, and figure out a way to talk about queer issues and issues of representation, and also just political and social issues, even beyond just LGBTQ stuff, and find a way to use the things that I loved to discuss them. A lot of the things that I found in my youth that were able to have me find an outlet for these feelings that I had that I couldn't really talk about as a trans person was through science fiction. It's sort of the easy place to sort of find your weird queer representation without being so overt about it. And so just trying to figure out how do I discuss those things. And so the channel was just basically me trying to work that out and figure that out, and also give myself a weekly goal too. I'm someone with a high level of anxiety, and this was a place for me to be look, I can sit down and force myself to do something every week, to try and make something every week. And so those are sort of the main impetuses. And then as it's grown, it's just sort of become a place for me to be look, I can try and advocate for for other people and other people who are need to be talked about and discussed, but also share my own personal stories and ideas that I think connect to the things that I love.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, you've done a really good job of it. And while you do focus primarily on kind of the social aspects of sex and gender in society, there is a lot of other things you talk about. I know I haven't watched it yet, but you just put out an episode about how to profit during a pandemic. On my watch list right now, so I'm going to be checking that out. But yeah, it's really exciting, honestly, throughout the entirety of the Picard series that had just completed its first season. Literally the two things I was excited about every week was watching the Picard show and then immediately afterwards jumping onto your channel and watching your breakdown.
Oh, thank you very much.
Oh, for sure. And my question, I guess, is why, in your opinion, does sci-fi lend itself so well to talking about these things that might seem scary or new or different or just not quote unquote normal? Why that medium?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's both the biggest strength of science fiction and the biggest, I think, problem with science fiction in a lot of ways too, in that science fiction allows us to externalize a lot of our biases and problems, and also like represent things that are outside, like as you put it, society sees as normal, quote unquote, and allows us to talk about them in a way that doesn't feel as politicized. I mean, like, unfortunately, gender and queerness and sexuality have been such politicized topics when they really shouldn't be. And so when you look at something like, Star Trek being sort of biggest obvious example, you can be like, all right, let's take this idea, the dynamics at play here, and then place them in a place that's so kind of removed from our day-to-day politics that we can actually sort of like just give a critical eye to how these structures and ideas work, how biases play out, how anxiety works out. And so like the example that I always give, for example, is my representation for trans representation when I was younger was the character of Dax in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Mm-hmm. She was a character who, she has a symbiote in her body that allows her to have memories of past lives, and her, directly previous life was as a man. And a lot of the characters that knew her on the show remember her being that man. And now she comes back and she's a woman. And so there's clear parallels to a trans experience in that. And it comes up a lot, like characters like misgendering her and things like that. But it's so removed. It's like, oh, it's this alien presence that we can sort of like talk about these issues without like someone coming in and be like, I don't want to see trans people in my, like my TV or things like that. So it was just sort of a great way to do that. And we can talk about this a little bit later, but it's also its greatest negative because sometimes it allows you to not see those parallels when they relate to the day-to-day life. Like, oh, I can see this like as an alien thing, but not as an actual human thing.
Right. It definitely, it helps because, if you're discriminating against like aliens that are blue because they're blue, that's foreign enough that it doesn't necessarily make you feel like a bad person for discriminating against somebody of a different color. But at the same time, it does very much other the other side. And it makes, oh, well, you're a human, you're normal. Here's an alien that you should be nice to because it can either hurt you or it's cute or something, but it's this other thing that, yeah, I can definitely see how that would be a concern. And I'm excited to dive into that a little bit more. Yeah. But first, I want to ask a little bit more about your channel and get an idea of how it's been received. Can you give us an example of maybe something that really felt affirming and inspiring, or maybe something that maybe challenged you, or maybe a not so positive reception that you've gotten often?
Yeah, I mean, it runs the gamut. I mean, especially as you grow bigger. Like I'm by no means the biggest channel out there in the world, but what's been really touching for me is creating this content and then seeing people react to it and actually feel like I'm saying something meaningful to them, because it's I don't know, it's always really affirming when you realize like, oh, this crazy stuff that like is floating around in my brain space and I put on a page and film and do all this stuff actually connects with someone. And so I don't know, it's just been incredibly touching to like get messages on Facebook or my Patreon or in the comments about people who's like, yeah, that's something that really meant a lot to me too. Like I loved Dax, or I really loved this part of, you know, DC Comics or this element of Star Trek, and that connected with me too as a trans person. And it's affirming in that way that like these thoughts that I have are connecting with people and actually reaching people, and actually and even more so that my experience and my connection with these aspects of science fiction and Star Trek in general aren't just my own, that there are people out there, especially for someone like myself. And I know a lot of like geeks and people who are sort of marginalized or on the sort of outskirts of society in many ways. We have a hard time, especially when we're younger, finding community and finding that connection. Mm-hmm. And so it's just been really cool to, as I've grown older and as I've built this community and built this channel, to see like, oh, there are people out there who felt this way too. And that's just, I don't know, like I never get tired of just looking at my Facebook messages or my Twitter messages or my comments and seeing people as like, oh, this meant so much to me. And like, that means so much to me to see that as well. And on the flip side, the other goal of the channel is to try to find connection with people that wouldn't necessarily think that they would have a connection with trans people. I mean, we talked about otherizing earlier, and one of the first things I realized when I came out as trans, sorry if I'm going really long, so apologize, feel free to cut me off, but
no, this is your show, you take it.
Well, thank you. One of the first things I realized when I came out as trans is how like people just felt the distance from that experience. Like I just remember having one night sitting with a friend and hearing this friend being like, I could never like I was describing my experience as a trans person, like I could never understand that. That sounds totally, you know, different. But I actually understand this feeling. And they would like, and that would just keep happening repeatedly over the night, that they would just keep identifying with me, but always like putting the asterisk of like, I could never understand on top of it. I'm like, but you clearly are. Mm-hmm. And so what I try to do is talk about my, like, there's always that idea of like the specific makes it universal. So it's like talking about my specific experiences, but then extrapolating it to show that like these feelings that I'm feeling of like dysphoria with my body, or not feeling like I connect with other people through like me being on the autism spectrum. Those are feelings that like a lot of people can have in many different ways. Mine just happens to come out through gender, but the core feelings are not so complex that other people don't feel it in other ways. And
that's
so
a really good point.
Yeah. And so that's what's been a lot of fun to see, like where I can connect with people that aren't trans. So it's just sort of that fun place.
Interesting.
Yeah. I was really curious about who some of these people are that are finding your channel, that are connecting with some of this content, and wondering, you know, the internet can be such an echo chamber, and like YouTube, you can find, you know, tons of trans creators, and that can be really self-perpetuating. Mm-hmm. But like, I think about myself, you mentioned that sci-fi can explore some of these ideas in like a safe way.
Yeah.
And I remember being like 9 or 10 years old and watching a story arc on Deep Space Nine where they go to like an alternate universe, and Kira is a lesbian. And I remember watching that with like sort of a surrogate caretaker and being like, well, no, she's evil. It's like alternate universe. Like, it's not the fact that like girls are kissing girls, like don't stress out about it, man. And not that your channel is like directed towards kids or anything along those lines, but I can just imagine the nerdy kid that I was at 10, 11, 12 years old wanting to learn more about that episode. And in this modern world, being able to find something like your channel, I'm really curious if you had those kinds of interactions, maybe with children or maybe not, but just with people that were maybe drawn to the show and ended up learning something about themselves, something about the world.
I mean, two things that I'm doing out that sort of immediately stick out to me having with you asking that question are like, one, I think the channel's for everybody. I think the goal is that anybody can connect with these things. And I've also found that, like, I mean, when I worked at The Advocate, our first goal usually when we started like doing videos, like, let's talk about like what's trans issues. The goal was usually like, try to talk to people in a way that's like, yeah, this stuff is complicated and weird, and I don't fully understand it either. Like, there's sometimes this tendency when we talk about trans issues, like, oh, everyone in the trans community really understands, and then we like try to educate people as well. But it's like a lot of the time, I'm like, I have no idea. I'm learning all about this trans stuff too. There's stuff I learn every day that's like, oh, that's an interesting way to think about gender, and it actually resonates with me really well. And so trying to go out to like other people and be like, hey, look, we're all like, I may be steeped in this a lot more, but we're all coming from a place of like, this is crazy and new and strange and really cool. And let's just have fun and get excited about like learning something new together. And so I hope that energy is what kind of brings everyone in, and even people who would initially be like, oh, I don't, this seems confusing and strange and weird to me. And I don't want to deal with it. And because it just seems so complicated and they don't have a place to like enter into it. So that's been super cool. And then the other element that you kind of talked about that sort of struck with me, also, you can see my cat hanging out in the background there, is I get a lot of messages from parents who reach out to me and say, I'm a big fan of Star Trek, or I'm a big fan of the show, and I came across your content, and my child is trans, and we watch your videos together because that's a way that we can connect, and I can like share my love of Star Trek with them, but then I can also learn a lot more about what it means to be trans through you, and we can kind of find a place to connect. Like, I've gotten so many messages from parents that share that story. It's I'm like always really touched by that quite often. Like it's, I don't know, it's just really cool that like there are ways that we can like connect with even the loved ones in our life and understand each other in that way through like science fiction and Star Trek. And I'm glad that I'm able to help enable that in some ways.
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
Really interesting to think about it in that way. Like, we're going to talk a little bit more about film and representation towards the end of this interview, but queer people, especially right now, people who are not cis, don't have media of their own, right? They don't necessarily get to say, this is my media culture. These are the shows written for me and by people like me and all of that. And so I feel like for some reason, and probably because exactly of what you just said, that it is a medium that lends itself to exploring things and, testing new waters and all of that. Sci-fi, and for some reason, Star Trek in particular, have become kind of this adopted culture. Like, oh, this is ours now. We're just going to claim this. This is ours. I had a conversation about Thor Ragnarok and how it is bi culture with somebody who is was not kind of like steeped in queer culture at all, and they were like, what makes it bi culture? And I was like, it's like how not sitting correctly in a chair is bi culture. They were like, what? I'm so confused. And it's like, no, you don't understand. We don't have anything. We need to find things that are ours.
Yeah. No, it's I mean, that's the story of like representation in so many ways, is like claiming, like we claim people as our own in so many different ways. Like there's, I mean, like it's just what queer people do. Anyone in the LGBTQ world are like, she's ours or they're ours, or, you know, like trans people have very much claimed Dax as like a trans representation, or like, you know, it's like the funny joke, but it's very true of like how many like gay men claim like very overtly powerful pop like women singers. They're like, yeah, she's part of gay culture, and like celebrate like those elements of it, because it's like they speak to us in a specific way, even though they may not be like one-to-one, like, yes, this person is trans, or this person's gay, or this person's, you know, a lesbian or bi, or anything on the spectrum. We resonate with them, and so we claim them and say like it becomes very important to us that we get these like little nuggets of representation where we can. And for me, and for a lot of people, science fiction in general is just that place, because as I've said before, and you brought up too again, is like, it's just where we can talk about the otherworldly, the strange, the things that are outside of the norm, quote unquote, and kind of have a safe space to do that.
Wonderful. Awesome. All right, so let's dive into what may be my favorite part of this conversation. Is so let's talk a little bit about Star Trek in particular, because we've been name dropping characters and referencing it a little bit, but let's kind of dive into that. So what do you feel Star Trek does particularly well in terms of being a kind of sci-fi flagship, for lack of a better term, and why do you resonate with it personally?
I mean, it's such a like large question.
I think let's just take the entirety of your channel and condense it into one question and throw it at you.
I mean, like, I'm just trying to figure out the best place to start. Like, what Star Trek does well, I think, is basically what I've been talking about, is that it like skirts this line of winking at the audience really well, of like, oh, this is an otherworldly thing. This is something different and strange and alien, but we all kind of know what it's really about. And so it's like this element that's like, it's very didactic, and very like beat you over the head with its metaphor, but it's just different enough that you can like get away with it. So we like all are very aware of what's going on with it, and what it's trying to say. And so when you have characters like Axe, where I mentioned her before, there's clearly some element where like, yes, she's supposed to talk about gender. Like, she's supposed to like represent gender in our everyday life. And so it's just kind of nice to have a show that's like, where like it tries to have this thin veneer, but it also like wears it on its sleeve, and kind of expressly just tells you what it's talking about. And so that's quite a lot of fun with Star Trek. And then also one of the things that, and this kind of gets into like the negatives as well, but it's what's kind of fascinating about it, is that it's also because it's a show that's been going on for 50 plus years, it's also a fascinating like yardstick of how far we progressed and how far we didn't, because some of the things that I find most fascinating about Star Trek is where it fails, is where it screws up, where it messes up, because for all of its benefits, it was generally written by, cis, straight, white men, generally upper class white men. And so well-intentioned for sure, but they make mistakes. They get things wrong. And then also the times in which they were made, not that excuses bad things, but the times in which they were made also limited a lot of what they could say and what they could do. Like, for example, to use something that's somewhat separate, is like, you go back and watch the original series with, William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, there's so much prescient metaphor being done there. Like talking about race and class and all these things. But then you also watch that show, and the way it treats women is so almost like behind the times for when it was. And that sort of like juxtaposition of like this show that like is so expressly, like its goals are like, we want to show how society can be better. Like Star Trek's this universe where it's supposed to be the ideal future where everyone just can exist and be a part of this world, but also it fails in that. And so I just think it's a wonderful discussion of like where we succeed and where we fail. Like we always talk about like how Star Trek is so progressive, but I also just think where Star Trek fails is equally as interesting as where it succeeds.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I think the one of the most interesting stories that I heard, and honestly, I may be parroting a video you did back to you because I watch way too much Star Trek related content, and a lot of it is yours. So if you have more insight onto this, feel free to jump in. But the episode with the genderless alien that Riker falls in love with, and how Frakes was like, we should cast this as a male actor, and kind of get across, because at the time it wasn't talking about gender, right? It was trying to talk about sex and doing it very gender.
Sorry, I don't want to cut you off, because but that's part of why it's so much fun. Like like that episode, like you watch that episode and you realize that, and it's this is me being super, it's the episode The Outcast from season 4 of The Next Generation. And even that title alone is like otherizing the outcast. But that episode was supposed to be like, this is our big gay episode, and we're going to talk about like how, you know, gay people are treated in society. But then you watch it and you're like, this is a terrible sort of representation of that, of like how sexuality works. But it is a super, super progressive look at gender and trans people. Like Riker literally asks in that episode for the character's pronouns, which, you know, it comes across as the writers being like, ooh, look at this crazy alien thing that we came up with, non-binary aliens.
We made this up.
Yeah. We're so clever.
No, I think that's one of the attractive qualities of that show in particular. They're constantly breaking things down and looking at society like a thing that we construct, right? Like there's nothing given in Star Trek necessarily. Everything is confronted by, well, why did we build it like this, right? Why did we come up with this as a concept, and why did we adopt this into our society? So they break down everything, and eventually, you know, they're going to get to things like sex and gender and pronouns. So it kind of like ramps up to that, where they're like, well, I guess we talk about this too, and I guess this is also a construct, and I guess we can also question, okay, that's enough, now let's go back to our normal viewing. But I absolutely find it fascinating. So I guess we talked a little bit. Fascinating. Okay, so literally, I have had partners tell me I say fascinating too much, and I'm like, I am aware. I know.
You never say it too much. Spock would be very proud.
That is all I needed to hear tonight. Thank you, Jessie. So I know you talked a little bit about Dax as a character that you really resonated with. Are there other characters or plot lines across the franchises that you kind of really enjoyed or felt spoke to you for any particular reasons?
I mean, I've mentioned this on my channel before, but like I pretty much in some way or another identify with, like, every Star Trek show has like the alien other that is like the sort of like strange, like, look at this interesting facet of society. Like the original series had Spock. The Next Generation had Data. Deep Space Nine had Dax, and Deep Space Nine in general, like, everyone was kind of an outsider. That was sort of that show. But the one that like sticks out for me the most, personally, is besides Dax, obviously, is 7 of 9 on Voyager, who is I really, really resonate heavily with her, mostly because, how best to explain, like, she is someone that has to relearn how to be human. And like, she was, to give a short, version of her story, she was assimilated by the Borg, an alien race, and as a child, and then gets unassimilated as an adult, and sort of like the rest of her journey in that series is relearning how to be human again. And as someone who like is on the spectrum, is on the autism spectrum, like that element of like having to learn about like why do people do these things? It makes no sense to me. It just like that really, really speaks to me quite often. And also like her desire to be like sort of standoffish and distant, but also wanting to be part of a group. And I mean, the Borg were a hive mind, so she likes being with people, but also doesn't really fully identify.
Mhm.
And I talked about that in a recent video about her, about how like I deeply, deeply resonate with that concept is like people on the autism spectrum, we generally sort of see them as like, oh, they're distant and aloof and kind of afar, but that's not how a lot of people on the autism spectrum are. We're very much like, we want to be very extroverted, but sometimes we can't be. And so kind of having like this constant struggle of like, I'm scared to get to know people, but also I want to get to know people. And that resonated with me heavily with 7 of 9. So I always enjoyed her. Plus Jerry Ryan is like, again, to talk about like where it succeeded, where it failed, like that show, she was brought into the show to be the sort of like sexy alien character, or like the like look, she's always wearing the cat suits, and like super objectified, and yet she's able to transcend that and bring us a character that was deeply nuanced, probably the best character on that show, despite the like very cynical nature of why she was created.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I was very skeptical when I first saw her on the show. I was like, oh, I know why you're here.
Yeah.
And I'm not mad about it, but also I know why you're here.
Exactly.
And then as the show went on, there were a couple episodes. I think honestly, the one that you reviewed in one of your last videos, that like sent me almost like into tears by the end of it, because I also find her character very compelling as somebody who kind of grew up very isolated, very much closed off from the world. And like, honestly, her introduction into Voyager was basically me in college. I was like, I don't know how to interact with people. I'm scaring everyone away.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, but Spock and Data, honestly, for me as well, always were like, you're safe for some reason. Like I would be okay if I was like around you. You would understand somehow. And you'd appreciate the number of times I say fascinating. Christy, how about you? Do you have any particular characters or plot lines that resonate?
Yeah, I mean, I always really enjoyed Cisco, and honestly, his religious journey. You know, if we may, his sort of exploration of, being a man of science, but also recognizing what he does and does not know, being confronted with a lot of sort of superstition and being tender-handed when dealing with these like very political, socio-religious issues. While also being open to having his own interesting experiences, watching him kind of go through that journey as the emissary over the course of 9 seasons, seven, yeah, was fascinating for me because this was all sort of laying the groundwork for me to undertake a lot of that journey, to be able to say like, I have had these experiences I can't explain. I don't understand why I, as a teenager, as a college kid, was falling under the Spirit, was praying in tongues. I did not know how to justify that in a scientific world. And knowing that you have to kind of ride that wave before you can come out the other side of it and have sort of an understanding of these things.
Yeah. I mean, that's why Deep Space Nine is the best, in my opinion, the best Star Trek, because it tackles...
I thought I was the only one who thought that.
No.
I'm sorry to jump in. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you.
It's so good. It's because it questioned those things in a lot of ways. Like it challenged Star Trek and said, here's your problems. Because up until then, this is a whole side tangent, but Star Trek, like Gene Roddenberry, I think famously said, like, anyone who believes in any religion is just a crazy person. That's me paraphrasing, but it was essentially like, religion is stupid and people who believe it are dumb. It was basically his attitude on it, which like I think is so diminishing of it. Like, I myself am agnostic, and I just liked that like Deep Space Nine was able to say like, look, Star Trek is a very secular world. Like everyone in the Federation apparently has just sort of wholesale given up on religion and doesn't believe in it and anything like that. But clearly that would still be an issue for other cultures, especially like in a society where it's very much talking about like the collision of culture. And so the fact that sort of got left out in the conversation a lot of the time, or was very like looked down upon, I thought was a missed opportunity. And Deep Space Nine took that and said like, look, we're not going to say like all elements of religion are great, but it said like, where's that balance, and where can we sort of find that like ability to be people of science, be people of who are very secular, but then also how do we engage with people who are very religious, and how do we like realize that there are elements of religion that we can actually say are beneficial while also rejecting the really horrible parts, like Kai Wynn in that show, who is just the worst kind of religious leader.
Yeah, well, just the utility of it. I mean, in the very first season, I think one of the very first episodes, they have an away mission and they're visiting the primitive village and they have all these crazy religious beliefs. And there is some of that like science looking down its nose. And then they recognize that, yeah, this is an imperfect model, as all models are imperfect, but that these myths that they're telling each other have a utility, that there's a purpose here. And even if we can sort of transcend that to a better model, to a more scientific understanding of the world, that religion didn't just happen, that it wasn't an evil plot, that there is a function that we have, perhaps evolved past, but that there's some purpose there. And I just really enjoyed that treatment.
Exactly. And like the collision of religions too in there as well. Like that's even another level deeper in there that Deep Space Nine gets into.
So I'm kind of curious, kind of going on this religion tangent, which considering
it's the Atheist Experience Network forte.
It's like considering where we are and where we're broadcasting from, totally cool with this. But so I grew up very conservative Christian, but I still remember watching The Next Generation with my whole family and never feeling those icky, like the devil is in the room feelings that usually came with watching any kind of secular media, even though, as we've been saying, it does really challenge a lot of preconceived notions and force you to think about things in different ways. So I guess my question is, why do you think conservatives or Christians embrace Star Trek alongside more progressive or, countercultural, quote unquote, people? And maybe how can we foster that to as a vehicle to foster better discussions?
I mean, it goes with a lot of what we were talking about earlier, right? Like, Star Trek is a place where we can talk about these issues without by having a distance from it. It's like, oh, we're not talking about, Trump. We're talking about, some crazy alien thing. But the ideas that are being presented are still salient to that discussion. And are still salient to the topic, but it doesn't feel like people are being directly confronted, which again is both a benefit and a negative. Like, it allows people to have this safe space to have these discussions and have these conversations but then also, because and this kind of gets into the negative of it too, is like, because it's not directly confronting these things a lot of the time, like directly saying like this is this, then it kind of allows people to sort of skate by and not necessarily challenge themselves and sort of like realize like, oh, this is talking about me. So I think that, again, that's sort of, that kind of gets away from your initial question about, because it gets into like why it sometimes fails, but I think it's important to talk about because, it's there's a place for both, I think. And this will kind of get into like the cis gays and all this other stuff that I'll be talking about later, but there's a place to kind of talk about these issues in a safe way. And I think that it's a great first step into this world. Like Star Trek, I think is the perfect gateway drug into into science fiction. I mean, it was for me. It's kind of funny because, and I've even said this before, I don't think that Star Trek, even at the time it was on, was always the best science fiction show, but it was there was like, you could almost point to any Star Trek show and find a contemporary show at the same time that was like better, quote unquote. But it's a show that felt safe to get into, felt like it was tackling these ideas, and also like was very aspirational and very like directly aspirational. Like, again, I mentioned before, like Star Trek tries to be the show that says like, look, this is us in the future. And in this future, we are accepting of diversity and difference, but it just takes that for granted. Like, it doesn't, like, you know, especially in the original series, like, oh, there's a woman of color on the bridge. Oh, there's, you know, people of different races and genders in different positions. And so like that ethos is what makes it super unique and different from like other shows on at the same time that maybe were, you know, better. But sorry, I'm like kind of meandering a little bit, so apologies on that. But like it's a show that, like, I don't know, I kind of lost the thread, so apologies.
No worries. We're talking about Star Trek. That's all that matters. I know we actually do have, I think, a caller.
Yeah, we've got some calls on the line. If you'd like to go ahead and jump on with Zarek.
Yeah, let's talk with Zarek in Texas. Hi, can you hear us?
It's Zarok.
Zarok. All right.
Hi, Christy. Hi, Jessie.
Hi.
Yeah, I was calling in to talk kind of about, like, I feel like one thing I have a problem with a lot of sci-fi is it never addresses transhumanism and, like, body dysphoria and being able to solve that. I feel like with science fiction technology, you should be able to change your looks or whatever to look like however you want, and yet there's no, like, maybe it's just budgetary reasons, but even in like novels, it seems like there's no like people who've turned themselves into robots like I would probably do if I were in the far future or stuff like that. And like in to the point where like transhumanist characters tend to be demonized in most science fiction media. Anybody who wants to be a robot or to change themselves to be greater, stronger, whatever, is usually the bad guy. And like Darth Vader is always one of my favorite characters, and he's clearly the villain, but he's this cool cyborg who's, I don't know, basically what I would like to be personally. But anyway, I don't know. I hope.
Yeah, it usually is a sign of a villain if they have some sort of, you know, technological advancement or appendage or anything along those lines in a lot of ways. I mean, maybe I guess we could point to a character like Geordi who uses a prosthetic, but even that feels like a bit of a stretch. Is that kind of the direction you were taking this question?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, Geordi is actually a pretty good example of like somebody who is like, I don't know, they're able to overcome their disability with technology, and I think that's definitely a good thing. But yeah, he's not very, like, I don't know, he doesn't go very far with it. So I feel like anybody who wants to go further than just than that is evil.
Yeah, and it's still couched in like he like lost something of himself in that. Like there's even in one of the movies where he gets his eyesight back, he's sort of like, oh, this is something that I never got to experience, which is understandable for, you know, someone who is disabled. Like that's a relatable feeling for sure. But it also is like still this discussion of when we augment ourselves in some way that we're somehow diminishing our base humanity. I mean, like it's a similar idea, like connecting it with like a trans experience even, like, and this is actually super fascinating now that I'm thinking about it, of like, I augment myself. Like I had had vaginoplasty, I've had breast augmentation surgery, and these are things that I've done to myself to make myself happier, to, you know, make myself more mentally stable. But like, there are people out there is like, oh, you're mutilating yourself. You're like making yourself like different than what, you know, like God or the universe or nature intended. And so that kind of ties into that same idea of like being villainized for like changing elements of yourself. And I also, just hearing what you were saying, like, made me think of a character like, this is outside of Star Trek, but like Cyborg in DC Comics, who like his whole arc is like, oh, am I still human because I've lost parts of myself? And that's sort of like a recurring theme of like, when we mix ourselves with technology, do we lose something essential of our humanity? And that a constant question in science fiction that's honestly, I think, a bit one-sided and sad that we don't discuss it from other angles. And I'm trying to think of more positive ones, but they're not immediately coming to my brain.
Yeah, I was actually just having a conversation about this with a partner about kind of, we were watching Westworld, and no spoilers, but the concept that being a host, one of these android robot people, was always a negative thing, right? And it was like, oh, well, they're not human. Well, what does that mean? like, how are we differentiating? And then the concept of, well, I'm sure that honestly, there are a lot of humans that I've gone through many a chronic condition during a flare where I'm like, I fucking wish I could be less quote unquote human. And, you know, I would honestly be very happy if I found out I was a host. of like, cool, this is awesome. No more need to worry about anxiety or whatever. But it's never presented as something that could help. It's never presented as something that is good or that can be used to assist you or make you better. It's always a derogatory thing. Even with Jordy, even with Data, it's always overcoming the technological in order to try and find some kind of concept of like a platonic ideal of humanity somewhere out there. I think it's very common in sci-fi to leave that part of the conversation out.
And actually, I just realized, with as limited spoilers as I can say, I just realized as you were talking, a show that has at least touched on this and has the potential to go even further with it, again, without spoiling too much, is Star Trek Picard. Thinking of how it ends.
Fair. Actually, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I don't want to discuss too much because I don't want to spoil for the audience, but yeah, there's elements in Star Trek Picard that I think touch on a positive version of that representation.
Yeah. So if you haven't seen Star Trek Picard yet, go watch all of it and watch Jesse's breakdowns of every episode, because those are helpful.
That is a really interesting question. I thank you for kind of bringing that up, because you're right. It is really one-sided.
Yeah. Just somebody with body dysphoria like myself, I've always kind of like wished to be like that, but it's example after example. It's like the Deus Ex Human Revolution character, the main character. He's a cyborg, but he's not happy about it. It was forced upon him, and he hates it. And I can't stand that. I'm so sick of it. Yeah. But yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for calling.
And actually, I just realized one other positive one. Just to quick give another one, because it's built into Star Trek. Like Khan and augments, like they said, like genetic engineering was outlawed, which does get into like eugenics and stuff as well. Like that was the clear parallel. But they actually do talk about like improving yourselves through the character of Bashir on Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, it's still, kind of couched in some of that, scare.
Is this right? Or we lost a part of, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we could go on and on about Westworld and Battlestar Galactica and Orphan Black all come back to these ideas that, like, don't mess with your God-given body. And I don't know why that's so sacrosanct. But if you like, I think we should go ahead and jump back on the lines with Maya.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Maya, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you guys.
Great. What can we do for you tonight?
Well, I've actually never told anyone this, but since I was young, I've always thought it would be better off if I was a male, and I'm not sure what that would look like, or if I'm just weird for questioning this, or my mom used to say that my dad used to treat me like a boy because he wanted a boy, and I don't know if that's why or anything like that.
Well, first off, I want to say, like, thank you for sharing that with us. That's, like, amazing. And from my perspective, like, this is something that when it comes to gender, and it's something that I've discovered too, is like I identified as trans and came out and wanted to be a woman. But as I've transitioned, I've also learned that my gender is very fluid and I like playing with it. I mean, I don't identify fully as a woman. I identify as a demi-woman or even sometimes gender fluid. And one of the things that's unfortunate about the world in which we live in is that we create these sort of binary categories that you have to be this and you have to be this way or you have to be that way. And I wish we allowed, and it's starting to happen, which makes me very happy. And I hope that you, Maya, are able to feel this and to have this chance to like play and to have fun. We tend to be like, oh, if you're trans, you're going to come out and you have to start transitioning. It's like, no, you can have fun. You can play with gender. Like gender shouldn't be this scary thing that we are put into, but it should be this area that you like have fun with and play with and just get to enjoy and revel in. Like that's, I don't know. I think gender is so much fun, and I'm saddened that we don't always allow people the opportunity to play with it. And so I don't know what your life is like or what chances you may have, but I would encourage you, Maya, to just play and like be like, maybe, you know, I get to use, maybe I'll ask someone to, maybe a trusted friend or something like that, like use he, him pronouns for me today, or maybe I'll dress a little bit more masculine today when I go out, or I just have fun in that way, because it's all just playing and there's nothing that you can't take back. Like we talk about pronouns as like, for example, to just use this example as like this thing is like, oh, these are my pronouns, but it's like pronouns are just words and they can change. So try them out, or try on different try them out like you would try on different clothing. And so, you know, I would just encourage you, Maya, if it's safe and if it's you're able to explore that part of yourself. Like there's nothing that has to say that you have to be like, oh, if you don't like it, that you can't not do that anymore. It's the joy of life and the joy of gender is that it's just something that we can play with, and it's something that's unfortunately just been politicized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The only problem with that is I have a boyfriend and he would definitely not be into that kind of thing.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
and that's the unfortunate part is life and other people and things like that. Well, like I said, I can't know your situation or how your boyfriend would react, but maybe it's something to, again, if it's safe or if you feel comfortable or if you're still figuring out, it's like maybe it's something to bring up, like just hint at or just have a small conversation about, like, hey, would you mind if I dressed, you know, a little bit more masculine or got this haircut that's a little bit this way? Just slowly but surely, number one, slowly but surely for yourself to be comfortable, and also maybe just slowly but surely like ease him into the conversation as well. But I know that's me saying that without having any context for your life, so I don't know how safe that is, but so yeah, it's kind of difficult, and so I'm sorry that that's sort of the situation you're in, but I that's the best advice that I could give is just try and take it slow, both for yourself and for your partner and people in your life.
Yeah, I'd second that. I think that there's again, kind of going back to the lack of media representation, the media representations we have of people who have transitioned or are in the process or are questioning their gender identity, it's kind of a very binary this or that. All of a sudden, everything's changed and you have an entirely new life. And sometimes that's the case. And sometimes that's what you want. And that's awesome. But it doesn't have to be oh no, I might not be a cis woman all of a sudden everything is different and I can never go back and I need to commit to all of this extra stuff, right? It doesn't have to be that. It can be, like Jessie said, as simple as trying out new pronouns with a friend you feel safe with. Or for me, it was buying boxer briefs and not even telling anybody, but wearing them and being like, oh, I'm walking a little bit different today. I like this. Or buying a man's scent of antiperspirant, which works 10 times better also. But just like little things that you get to play with before you have to make any big decisions, because you can take years in this middle stage that honestly for me, I think I'm always going to be in this place. Like, this doesn't have to be a transitory area. It can be where you are and be fine. Or you might move in one direction or another, but it doesn't have to be something you think of overnight or commit to right away, especially if you have relationships that you care about, especially if you have a life you like. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to leave that. And if it does come down to that, and I've been there, I've been broken up with because my partner knew, even really before I did, that I still needed to go explore myself and my gender and who I wanted to be. And it sucks and it's scary and it's not ideal, but it's also a worthwhile trade-off, I would say. I think that if it does ultimately come down to that decision, I am so much happier where I am now than where I was. And I didn't even realize at the time that I was unhappy or that I was struggling or that there were these intense growing pains until I looked back and was able to contrast it with how I feel now. So I'm not saying that's how it's going to be. I could not say that as a stranger on the internet. But if it does come down to that, it will be worth it.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing.
Thanks for calling in, Maya.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care. Yeah, I think the most important takeaway, if it's not evident already in this hour-long conversation comparing gender to Star Trek, is that, yes, this stuff is incredibly important, but it's also really silly.
Yeah.
And that's okay. You can try a gender on. You can experiment and play around with these things, even if that's getting into a chat room and telling everybody your name is Frank when your name is clearly not Frank. That can actually scratch an itch.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's all you need, and that's fine, and that also is valid. And sometimes it'll, again, like Star Trek is the gateway to sci-fi. That might be the gateway to questioning more and finding more about what works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm glad that y'all both hit on just that idea of trying on new things. It doesn't have to mean anything or go anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something that I've come to understand about myself, is that my identity is based in like a fluid identity. Like I identify as gender fluid. I identify as, bisexual. I identify as agnostic. So it's all like this, like being comfortable. I loved how you said, V, it's fine to live in that transitory space. Like my whole identity is a transitory space, and life is a transitory space. We search for these static identities and static things that we can cling to. And you got to have some sort of goalposts and things that you cling to in your life, but also we should allow ourselves to be a little bit more fluid, because it's all made up and the points don't matter. So, so these are all just rules that we've all made up as a society. And sometimes it's okay and this is what Star Trek does, is poke them and say why is it that way?
Exactly. Let's go to one more call, and then we will jump to whoever's left on the line after our third portion of the interview. You want to take Skipperella in Texas?
Yeah, let's go ahead and jump on in.
Hey, Skipperella, how are you doing tonight?
Oh, very well. Hi, everybody. Oh, crap, I'm on the spot. Now I'm all nervous and crap.
What can we help you with?
Jessie, by the way, thanks again for being my 300th follow. Love you, girl. So,
Thank you. I was about to ask, is this the Skipperella who's always on my channel? Nice to talk to you finally.
yes, indeed. Yeah, I'm that vaguely stalker bitch. Anyway, so, so here's my thought. Much like you, lifetime Star Trek fan, and so for general reasons and also for trans reasons, I'm just sitting here thinking, well, crap. If they just abduct Troy and turn her into a Romulan while she's sleeping, an afternoon in sickbay can make me a very cis-looking girl if I just have enough time to sweet talk the EMH. Mm-hmm. So, that being said, now all of Star Trek now is very a product of its time, so they're not going to get into that, right? But god damn if they don't have the technology. So, knowing what we know, the technology that we have, how do you think that would play out? I've seen a lot of headcanon out there. You spend enough time on the Daystrom Institute, that'll do it. But I'm just curious what, you Jessie, and all of you think, assuming you could just male on Friday, female on Sunday, and just as much time as you have to bug the doctor, you could kind of do whatever. How does that change how this works in society at large?
Well, yeah. Ooh, okay. Well, first things first, I should say.
I know it's a thing and a half.
No, it's. I mean, it touches on everything we've been talking about, like being okay with living in a transitory space, and also I should say in Star Trek they do show there's an episode, and the episode itself is questionable in its representation, though not as bad as some. There is an episode in Deep Space Nine where Quark actually gets surgery to become a woman. And then he gets surgery to become a man. That episode, it's a female. He literally becomes female for a day. So yeah, and so it is clearly in canon in the show that you can switch genders and switch back at the drop of a hat, and no one has really a problem with it. So that is in there.
Can't help but feel like that technology would get used. If it really was available, just to Skipperella's question, if it is a simple procedure, I think that's going to reduce a lot of the stigma around it. I think that's going to really take some of the stress and strain and some of the politics out of gender. And I think whoever invents it is going to just make a killing.
Yeah. And also,
think about the face swap apps. Even that level is now kind of playing in that space. Granted, in a lot less cool sci-fi way, but still, people are like, "Ooh, I want to see what I look like as somebody with a beard or with long hair and makeup on. That seems cool." And there is this softening of that gap that line we put between the ends of that spectrum. I would absolutely love to live in that world. That sounds awesome.
And I think it would build empathy for different people too, or eliminate the need for empathy in certain situations where it's just oh yeah, I totally get what it's like to be a woman, because when I was 5, I lived as a woman for a week, and it was that was cool, but not for me. That it would just be this birth of understanding. I think would come out of that if you could just go to the doctor and be hey, I want to be a woman today. Is that cool? It's like make theme parks. Walk through as a woman today, something like that. I think it'd be a lot of fun. And I think it would, like you were saying, just break down these rules and preconceived notions that we'd have.
I feel like it would also be funny to I think it would be a lot more difficult to gauge, because you'd catcall someone and the next day they'd show up as this 6'5" dude, just excuse me.
Well, just the wage gap would have to evaporate overnight.
Yeah.
If we're all just a bunch of sneetches that can jump in and out of a machine and switch willy-nilly, a lot of these hard and fast rules just go out the window.
Yeah, and it also I put it in the context of Star Trek. It also helps us find what is universal for all of us. You see in Star Trek, there's so many different alien races that sort of define themselves certain ways. In Star Trek does have the problem with monoculture, but in a way there's an element of an understanding of where that comes from, even if it, because people criticize different species wouldn't have a monoculture, but it's sort of like, well, if we go out into space and meet all these different aliens too, there's an element of like, well, what makes us unique and what makes us human, and trying to find our universality within ourselves. But then again, from there, trying to find universality with other aliens and other people and other races. So it's just like, it's this constant, I mean, it's this constant question of what makes us unique and what makes us different. And often the answer is what makes us unique is what makes us the same in a lot of different ways. I mean, it goes back to what I was talking before, like my feelings as a trans person can connect to people who are not trans, even in different ways. So it's like our differences showcase how we are the same.
Well said.
That's an awesome question. Thank you so much, Skipperella.
Yeah, no problem. It'd be amazing how much understanding we could get if we could treat gender like a 30-day free Netflix trial that you can cancel at any time.
And then I forget to like cancel my card, and it's like, crap, I'm renewed for another month.
Hey, sign me up.
There you go. Hey, I'm all out of gender. Could you hook me up for like 30 days? I swear to God. Something like that.
There you go. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Oh, that was a good question.
Yeah, it was really good.
Yeah, now I'm just flashing back to that episode of Boy Meets World where Sean dresses like a woman and gets hit on for a day.
Yeah,
this TV rabbit hole is a lot of fun.
Oh,
yeah.
Billy, I did a whole video on how Scooby-Doo helped me realize I was transgender, because there's a scene in that movie, the like live action one, where they all switch bodies. And Fred is in Velma's body or Daphne's body. He's like, I'm going to look at myself naked. And I realized, like, why would you? And I'm like, oh, I wish I was a girl. Also, this is how I learned about sex. So like Scooby-Doo was just a weird awakening for me.
Nice.
In a very strange way.
We will have to have you back on and we'll talk about Scooby-Doo.
Oh, gosh.
All right. Well, we've got a couple more calls, but I do want to make sure that we get to this last part of the interview, which is more about the book that you helped to write, and something called the cis gaze. So in the book you contributed an essay to, Navigating Trans and Complex Gender Identities, you talk about the cis gaze, which you describe as kind of a counterpart to the male gaze often discussed in film. What is this? Is this kind of like a Bechdel test for trans and non-binary folk, or how would you describe it?
No, and actually in a lot of ways we've kind of been discussing it ourselves. So let me just give like a brief download on film theory. The male gaze is this idea in film that that film is made with the assumption that the person watching is male, and that the sort of, again, the normal audience is a straight, cis, white, upper middle class male. And that's the perspective that we always take on when we're watching a film. So when you watch a movie, women, when we're talking about the male gaze, are always seen as the other. Like, think of, I use this because it's sort of the most egregious and obvious example that people can instantly recognize, but it's by no means the only one. But think of like the movie Transformers, where we meet Megan Fox. The camera like lingers on her body. She's sexualized. She's got this, like, her midriff is exposed, like shots linger on her breasts. Like she's sort of seen as this thing to look at, to watch. And that's the view that the camera takes on, the view that the director, the person making the film, takes on, and the characters themselves. Like, the characters are sort of like, you're following, in that movie, what's his face? Shia LaBeouf's character was a guy. And so, and I could go pick any movie, literally any movie whatsoever ever made, and you'll generally find that it has a male gaze, where the assumption is the audience is male. So, and that sort of male gaze idea has led to so many different elements of film theory and discussion of film analysis. It's one of the, like, fundamental texts if you're ever going to talk about film theory, if you go into school for it. So what I postulated in my book is the same sort of thing, and by no means is mine as rigorous as like film theory was. It's sort of like an introduction, but it's this idea of the cis gaze, that the assumption is the audience watching a film is cisgender, that they are not trans. And so what does that do for trans people in film? Now, in, decades previous, what that meant was like usually trans people were fairly otherized, seen as like villainous or deceitful or different, or otherized. But my contribution was more like looking at it in a modern context of like how trans people are represented. And what that typically comes out of that are two different types of stories, where trans people are seen as an other. One is transition stories, where we see, like, at the start of the film, you have a trans character who like lives just like anybody else, like a normal person, but then they realize they're trans, and the whole arc of the story is them transitioning and coming out at the end. And so the whole point of the story is like, look how different they are from where they began to where they ended, and look how different this story is from a typical experience as that someone in the audience would be. It's like, oh, the whole point of going to watch this movie is that it's this fascinating, different spectacle story. When like I go and watch those types of movies, I'm like, yeah, that's I'd lived that just seems normal to me. That's just like existence in my world. And then the other one is what I call oppression narratives, which is stories of like how hard it is to be a trans person. It's like, it's like, oh, like trans people dealing with like oppression and overcoming adversity and things like that. And so the otherization there is, oh, I see how different their life is from mine, how radically strange and different their life is, and I feel bad, or I want to try and do an impetus for change. And I make this sounds all very negative, but there is a lot of benefit to those stories. I mean, that's what Star Trek is. Like, Star Trek is all those stories, is like trying to get people to feel something and understand someone else's experience. So that's what a cis gaze today is. But the problem with that is that it perpetuates this idea that trans people are different, that we're strange, that our lives can't be normal. And so like my day-to-day is something that's so alien and otherized and weird from everybody else's that it's somewhat incomprehensible. And so what I talk about in that, and sorry, I'm just like downloading the whole book, but what I talk about is like the need, and we're starting to see this too in a lot of ways, the need to just have trans people and queer people just be part of stories. That it's important to have these like narratives talking about like the oppression that we face or the differences that we have as queer people or trans people. But also it's important to just be like, oh, I get to just take part in a story. And it's one of the things that I'm really saddened about that Star Trek hasn't done yet, and it looks like it might be doing in the next season of Star Trek Discovery, but we'll see, is that like it's talked about trans people through these allegories in many ways and many different times, but so rarely have we just gotten we have never gotten a character in the show where it's just like, oh, I get to see a trans person just having fun with the crew. That my story doesn't have to be like, oh, look at me dealing with trans issues today. It's like, oh, I'm going to go and help deal with this weird time travel, crazy, wibbly wobbly, save the universe type stuff. And then also maybe the fact that I'm trans will inform something here or there. But generally, I just get to take part in that narrative.
Yeah, it's very interesting because people want a lot of like brownie points for, including like diverse stories and plot lines and characters. And oh, look what we did for you. Here is a show about how hard it is to be a trans person. Aren't you happy with this thing that we've created? It's like, well, no, like clearly this wasn't actually filmed for me. Like this wasn't written or directed or cast with the idea that people who were not cis would be in the audience. I was like, well, maybe we'll be a reviewer in the New Yorker talking about the critical acclaim of it, but we're not the ones going and consuming the films and actually being touched by them. It's so interesting. And I can't believe I I never thought about it, honestly, in that way. There was always this disconnect and there was always this frustration, but actually coining that term, I remember when I listened to the video where you gave the review initially, I was like, oh, I love that. I want to talk more about it. So in terms of sci-fi then, because I know that you, I believe you reference a couple sci-fi TV shows, not just Star Trek, but I think you talked a little bit about Sense8 and some other shows about either really good examples of this is the cis gaze and this is what you don't do, and maybe this is how you should approach it instead. Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I think the two ones that I personally really, really love. One is Sense8, like you mentioned. And it helps that show is, by the way, written by and directed by trans women, the Wachowskis, which I can never say the name correctly, so apologies to them. But there's a character on that show that is very much a trans woman, but she is more defined as a hacker. Like her utility to the narrative of the show is that she can hack any computer, she can break into these networks, and she can do all these things. But the fact that she is trans is not just incidental. Like her transness does come up. Like her relationship with her family is an issue that is dealt with throughout the show. That like she's not on good terms with her mother because she is trans. But that is not her defining feature. It is not the only thing she does in that story, in that narrative. It's not like, all right, well, we're gonna cut to the trans storyline now. It's like, oh, she's a fully fleshed out character that contributes to the story that also happens to have things that relate to her being trans that she's dealing with, and also allows her to think in different ways too. Like she's able to connect with a gay man in a few scenes because she is trans. Like she finds a common connection there. And it also like this also kind of gets into what we've been talking about. It's also why the Wachowskis are some of my favorite filmmakers, in that like their films are not fitting into the cis gaze because they're not trying to educate or show that trans people are different, but showing how we're the same. Like the whole conceit of Sense8 as a show, I could talk forever about Sense8, but is that there's these clusters of people that are empathetic across, they like share emotions and bodies and things like that. And so that's such a uniquely like trans idea, I think, or like othered or minority group idea of like we can find, like what we've been talking about, empathy in our differences and find shared similarity in our differences. That's what that show literally is about. And I think that that's something that you get when you give like trans creators control of something. And then the other one that I'll quick mention, sorry, I don't want to cut you off if you had a...
It's probably a good thing that you do cut us off because
it's well documented that we like Sense8. Yeah, like go and watch our back catalog, everybody. Like you don't need V and I to do this right now. We're trying to get the rest of the calls in under the wire.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I ran for so long. Well, I'll mention one more science fiction example, and then I'll sort of to like show something that's slightly different, but in the same vein of positive trans representation, and that is the character of Dreamer on Supergirl, who is a sort of trans superhero on that show. And for that character, it's written by, she's a character that's not written by trans creators. The creators of that show are men. I think a gay man is the executive producer. But she's just written so well in the sense that, like, you don't even know she's trans for the first few episodes. And then the only reason it comes up is when, like, it's like something that she relates to. Like in the show, they're talking about like literal aliens that are living on Earth being otherized and demonized in the media. And so she comes up and she's like, hey, as a trans person, that's what trans people have faced for a very long time. And I don't think that we should do that in our paper, because she's a journalist. And so it was like her transness was relevant to the conversation, but it was not something that defined her character. But then there's other episodes of the show where her trans identity is very salient to the plot, in that, like, there's one episode where we learn that in her family, her powers, the superpowers she has, are only given to women. And she has an older sister who she hasn't told that she has these powers. And so her sister's like, well, I'm going to get these powers any day. they're gonna come, right? Because I'm the only woman in our family. I'm the only biological woman. And then she learns that her sister, who's trans, got the powers, and she's so jealous and angry because she's like, "You're not a real woman. How could you get these powers?" And I just loved that because it was validating a trans identity. Like, she is just as much a woman as anyone else. Like, these weird mystical sci-fi powers validated her, but it also showed the issues that trans people face. Is like, oh, you're not a real woman, and even in your family who is accepting of you, in some ways, could still harbor those biases. And so, I think Supergirl just does a fantastic job in its representation of a trans person.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'll have to check that one out. I have not seen that yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I
it's
guess
also an Arrowverse show, so there's a lot of mediocrity in there as well.
okay, I'm a supernatural CW person, so I can take that kind of cheese. So I guess my last question for you, Jessie, before we jump to these final calls and then say goodnight, is how do we be better about representing marginalized groups, especially when it comes to things like gender expression and experience in film and TV? What do you want to see in the future?
I mean, I kind of just brought it up, but like, just more stories where trans people or marginalized groups, really any marginalized groups, just to get to take part in the fun. And I always couch it in science fiction because that's my bread and butter and what I love the most. Like, just let us have cool action moments. Like, let us, be a superhero and let us discuss like random weird stuff or other ideas beyond being trans or being, part of a marginalized community. But don't let our identities become incidental. Like, again, we've been talking about this whole show. Our differences are what make us unique, but also what make the experience universal, and what we can find connection through. And I think that there's a lot of value to be had in just letting us take part in stories. Just let us have fun in the adventure of humanity in many different ways. Like, let us be in political action thrillers. Let us be in, strange dramas, the weirdest science fiction, the most hard-hitting things where our transness isn't important in the most important thing, but it's still part of us. And then there's also places too to talk about, our oppression and our the ways we are marginalized. Like, there's enough for all of it. There's enough room for all of that. I just think that it's been heavily weighted in one direction for a very long time, and we're fine. I'm at least glad that we're kind of out of the place where we're villainized, but or like completely otherized. So takes are much more sympathetic now in media. So I appreciate that, but there's still a sense of otherization that I think we still need to move beyond. And so that's what I'm really hoping that, and we're starting to see it. It's not fully there yet, but we're starting to see it. That I think that's sort of the next step that needs to be taken.
Wonderful. I couldn't have said it better myself. And everybody, if you want more of these awesome hot takes and talking about gender and talking about sci-fi and kind of starting to be a person who makes a difference just in the kind of media that you consume, definitely do check out Jessie's channel. We will be giving you links and all of that at the end of the show. But let's jump to the last two calls who have been waiting so patiently. Let's jump through these fairly quickly.
Okay, yeah, let's start by talking to Sean. Sean, we've got just a few minutes, but we'd love to hear what's on your mind.
How's it going? Hey, if you don't mind, this question is it's a little like a hot topic, I guess. So it's really, I want to give an opinion, and then if y'all could answer, I can hang up right after I ask a question. Is that cool?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, my opinion is it seems like this is particularly in gay people, I guess. It's my opinion that both parties, when having sexual intercourse, should be responsible to give all the information of the people they've been with within 3 months of being together, like at that moment. As in, like, you should be able to ask the partner, whether it's one hookup or been with them for a while, what their sexual encounters with others are. If I don't know if that does that make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Did you have a question or just want our opinion on that?
That I guess it's more of I was trying to give my opinion, and I don't know if that's like, because some people when you're trying to ask them like how many people they've been with in the last 3 months, when was the last time they had sex, they get hostile, and I guess that was my question, and I was throwing my opinion out there.
Yeah. Thank you for calling in. And we can certainly jump into that a little bit before jumping to this last caller. I think for me, I don't know if I would necessarily expect names and numbers from a partner, but certainly a clean bill of health and information about whether or not my partner had, gotten checked for all the required tests in the time span that was appropriate. So I think for me, it would be less of how many people have you been with, when was the last time, and more about, hey, are you safe? Are you clean? Are you going to come into this responsibly? And if the answer to that is yes, and then we're good to go as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think I 100% agree with that. It's like I don't need specifics. And it's everyone's right to kind of not be specific if they don't want to give specific history. But yeah, as long as you're being honest and being safe, like if you've gotten a clean bill of health. And one other thing that I'll sort of add to your thought is like this question comes up a lot too for me personally is as a trans person that like when do I reveal that? And I've just generally, because I don't really care. And I live in a place where it's safe to be out. That I just say that up front. It's like in my dating profiles on websites, but there are some people that it's not safe to do that. And it's not safe to acknowledge that. And so it sometimes takes time to get to know somebody before revealing that you're trans. And so I think it really just comes down to questions of making sure you're protecting the other person in terms of like, making sure they're consenting to everything in terms of like their health, but also acknowledging when you are safe as well to reveal to that person. So I think those are the two things, like not harming someone else's bodily autonomy, but also making sure you are protecting your own safety as well.
Right. That's a really good point. And my only other caveat, now that I come to think of it, is this is only applicable for like hookups or one night stands or casual encounters. If you are in an open relationship or a poly relationship, then definitely communicating about who you've been with and all of that, probably a lot more realistic and helpful in the long term to be open and communicative about that. But yeah, for casual encounters and dating and hookups like that, I think, make sure you're protecting the physical health of the other person. And make sure that you are being responsible in that way. But you also don't owe people private information about yourself, especially if you don't know them very well or don't necessarily feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let me actually push back on a couple of things that y'all said. I don't know that there is a right amount of information. I don't know that there's any amount of information that you're owed. I think it's really more about the level of communication and what you feel comfortable with, your level of risk. We recognize that there's no such thing as safe sex so much as safer sex. And to even step away from the idea of like a clean bill of health, rather, I think it's much more important to look at it in terms of, are you getting tested? Do you have multiple partners? What are your procedures? And I think that you have the right to ask any question. You also have the right to not answer any question. If you just got back from a bareback orgy, I don't know that you owe that information to anybody, but I do think that you have an obligation to be honest, to answer questions in a sincere way, or to say clearly, I'm not going to answer that. And then I think people need to be smart about who they're choosing to have sex with. That doesn't mean that you can't have a 100-person orgy. That doesn't mean that you can't have sex with a stranger, but you should be able to ask them these questions and to trust their answers. And I don't know that there is some number of, well, how many people in the last 3 months, or are you allowed to get like 6 months of history, or I want to see 2 years of medical records. I think it really needs to be framed more in terms of the relationship, because whether this is somebody that you've been with for 50 years, or whether somebody that you just snuck into a bathroom with at a bar, it really comes down to what makes you feel safe, what makes them feel safe, and that connection and that communication between the two of you.
That's a good point. Yeah, as long as in the same way you have a right to not answer questions if you don't want to, the other person does have a right to ask them. And if you feel like you want to ask questions of a partner, you have the right to ask, I think. Again, being careful about, being respectful of the other person and keeping in mind that if they are somebody who is smaller than you or socialized to be more accommodating or whatever the case may be, you are also keeping in mind power dynamic and all of that. But yeah, I think, again, open communication in both directions is ideal.
Yeah.
Fair to say. Well, moving on quickly, let's talk to April in Kentucky. April, what can we do for you tonight?
Hey guys, I feel like we're kind of getting to know each other via these calls.
Hello again.
This is the third call. Yeah. You guys are really the only people I can talk about this stuff honestly with. So guess what? You get to be my therapist. So sorry about that.
Well, we will have the caveat that at least I am not a therapist. We do have one on the line, but I want to make sure that that's out there. That is, I will listen, I will support you, but I cannot therapize.
Well, that was tongue in cheek, honestly. Yeah. This has been a big show to unpack, honestly, and I hate that I kind of came in on the tail end of it, but it's funny because growing up, my father was he was a reader. He read extensively, and some of his favorite authors were like Tom Clancy, Isaac Asimov, and so those were things I was reading, as a 13, 14-year-old kid. So I kind of grew up thinking bigger than the way I grew up, if that makes sense, like the universe was bigger, things were exponentially, there was more opportunity. There were things out there because those kind of books kind of drive you to think about things other than where you are. Right. And it's funny because the whole Star Trek thing, after coming out, I think the first trans person that I actually remember coming in contact with after growing up in a religious cult and being so sequestered. And I was in cosmetology school, and this girl came in, and she was obviously very masculine. She sat down for a haircut and started becoming a regular client. And, she started opening up to me because people do that with me. I just tend to be, people understand that I don't give a shit. You can tell me anything and I don't care. And so they kind of open up. And so she kind of was talking about being a drag king and stuff. And I finally looked at her one day and I told her, I said, you have to be you. And it doesn't matter who or what you are. The people who love you are going to love you for who you are. And the people who don't matter. And she started crying and I started crying. And we had this weep fest over her haircut, And 4 years later, she came out as trans and she started her therapy. And now he is Christian and he is married to this beautiful girl and they have an amazing marriage and he is so happy. And I'm like, oh my God, I got to be a part of that, I got to be a part of that and be a help to him, and he still, he'll text me or he's very open with me and we still communicate. And it just, and I go back to the Star Trek thing. And I think for me, instead of going so far reaching into the universe, as far as who we are as people and gender, I go more internal and more basic and more instinct. And I look at who are we at our very base? We're animals, right? We are mammals, just like all the other mammals on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And of all the other mammals on Earth, most of them, there are gay couples, right? There are female lions who will act like male lions. There are female penguins who will act like male penguins, and vice versa. And we are no different than the most basic mammals on Earth. And I think we've put ourselves on this pedestal as above other mammals when, in fact, we are no more than them. The only difference is that we have the ability to speak and communicate in written and spoken language. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that has helped me with my own sexuality a little bit. For the first time, I wore a 3-piece suit and tie to a funeral back a few months ago, and
Heck yes.
4-inch heels and makeup and hair done, and I looked like amazing. And people were looking at me, and I'm like, "Look, bitch, I don't care. You wish you could rock a tie, you know." And I don't know if that's weird, but
No, it's
a long time
amazing,
here
is what it
because
is.
I was androgynous.
Yeah.
I'm very androgynous. I can be very, very feminine and rock the 4-inch heels and makeup, but I can also be underneath my truck working on the brakes. And, you know, and I thought, well, I have to be one or the other. I have to pick something. And then I finally realized I don't have to fucking pick anything. I am who I am. And if people don't like it, they can fuck off, you know?
Yep.
I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Just like, it's all made up and the points don't matter. And I mean, that's what Star Trek has always been about, is like, look, these are just made up rules that we have just come up with. Like, I liked something that you said, V, earlier, is that like Star Trek just shows us that these are all just rules that we made up, and that we're just poking at it and playing with it and seeing what dynamics come out of all of that. And generally the rule is it's all made up, and we're just trying to figure it out and trying to make up our own rules as we go along.
Yeah. That is awesome, April. And I think... Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to go back to the whole we're all animals. That's, to me, always something interesting to bring up with people who, for some reason, are convinced it's, you know, quote unquote, not natural to be anything other than cishet. It's like, well, have you looked at literally the rest of the natural world?
Come gather round, children, and let me tell you about the bonobo.
Yeah. Right. Well, you know, it's funny because right now I'm kind of dealing with my father, who literally laughed and rolled his eyes at me when I told him, weeping, that I had tried to commit suicide because I could not come to terms with being gay. Literally, he laughed and rolled his eyes at me, and now he is on his deathbed, dying of congestive heart failure, and I can't feel sympathy. You know, I feel more anger, if anything, because I don't have the opportunity for him to ask for forgiveness, if anything, right? Like, I've already buried him emotionally years ago because of the way they treated me. I walked away from that toxic environment. But, you know, now I'm more than likely going to have to bury him physically. And at this point, I'm just like, get it fucking over with, because I don't need people in my life like that. You know, I don't care if you gave birth to me. I don't care if you're my biological parent. People put so much weight on that type of relationship, like it's supposed to mean more. But if you look at the animal kingdom, how many fathers in the mammal kingdom, how many fathers will actually kill their children if the mother doesn't shelter them from the father, right? How many of the cat breeds actually will go in and kill the children when they're infants if the mother doesn't hide them? That's common. But we think we're special, right? We think we're supposed to be above that. And we think we're supposed to get pity because, oh, my dad doesn't love me. Well, guess what? 99% of the fucking mammal kingdom, their fathers don't love their children. So why are you special? You know, just get that out of your head. Stop thinking that relationships that we have deemed are important are actually important, and start making the relationships that make you important, those are the ones you should think about, right?
Yeah, I think we put this emphasis on
response.
Yeah, we put an emphasis on forgiveness and reconciliation, and more often than not, it's the disadvantaged or the victimized person who is going to be asked to forgive and to forget and to move on and to go back to a situation that maybe was extremely harmful. And that is not a requirement. In order to be a good person, you don't need to forgive everybody and forget everything bad that they've done or let them back in your life. And even if you do want to forgive them, that doesn't even necessarily mean that you have any emotional attachment to them at all or interact with them at all.
Right.
So yeah, there is absolutely nothing wrong with having buried your father emotionally years ago. And honestly, I was in the same boat. And when my dad killed himself last year, it really, it was maybe 5-10 minutes of grief. And then it was pretty much, I was okay because for 5 years prior, I had not interacted. There had been no emotional connection there because he had been abusive, and it made it easier in a horrible way. But yeah, I'm sorry you're having to go through this. It's not something I'd wish on anybody, but I think that you're coming at it from the right perspective, that this is just something that happens and it's not an evil thing or a thing to be torn up about. If you're fine, that's good. It doesn't mean anything bad about you. You are a strong person, and you will continue to be one after this passes.
Mm-hmm.
I can't help but think, a friend of mine told me, you need to write down in a journal everything you would say to him if you could talk to him right now. And I said, I don't need to write it down. I know what I would say. I would say, I loved you and I respected you my entire life. And when I came out, you changed. I didn't. So I don't need forgiveness. You do. Period. So, for anybody who has had to come out, anybody who has had to come out as gay or trans or bi or whatever you have had to tell your family that doesn't meet their paradigm of, perfection for their child or whatever, you didn't change. They decided that who you were wasn't good enough, and that's not on you, that's on them. And you have to just move forward,
I agree.
I always look at it, just to be quick and say something, it's just coming out is a gift. Coming out is a gift that you give yourself and a gift that you give to others. And if they reject it, that's on them. And hopefully it doesn't harm you. And that's this whole other conversation. But to come out is a gift. And that's the most important thing to realize.
Yeah,
exactly.
Thank you so much for calling in, April. I really appreciate you sharing with us. And again, we love hearing from you. So feel free to call back.
Love you guys. Have a good night.
You too.
Take care.
Woo. April needs to be like a motivational speaker. Like she needs a Netflix show or something. All right. We're a little bit over time. Jessie, thank you so much for coming on board and for sharing your thoughts with us. If people are interested in watching more of Jessie, you can find her YouTube channel at YouTube/Lost Trekkie. That's 1 T. And you can follow her on Twitter as well at Jessie Gender. And you can get the book Navigating Trans and Complex Gender Identities at bloomsbury.com. And we will have the link for that in the description, so you can find it there. And if you are interested in following Secular Sexuality, we are at Secular Sex on Twitter. You can email us with your questions at sex@atheist-community.org. I got it right this time. And you can leave a voicemail in our voicemail box if you like calling in, but either can't because you're not available at the time we're live, or you prefer to leave a voicemail. That is 512-666-ASK. That's 512-666-0275. And we will play those on the air and answer them then. Christy, Jessie, any last thoughts? Ooh, merch. Yeah, forgot about that. We've got merch now. That's exciting. Get a throw pillow.
I love these. These are wonderful.
And thank you
And
to
of course, our
host crew.
scattered crew working from homes all over Austin and beyond.
And very creepily in sci-fi, like remote manipulating all of the monitors that are on all by themselves at the ACA and probably not freaking any of the neighbors out there. All right. I think it's just about that time.
Yeah. Like I said, thank you so much for having me on. It was a really, really fun conversation. I really enjoyed it.
I'm happy we got to give you a little bit of our platform, because you certainly deserve that. Christy, you want to take us out?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I really just want to talk about Sense8 for a couple more hours, but
I'm happy to oblige you.
Right? Okay, so we're gonna do that. But real quick, all the rest of you, thank you so much for being here. Take great care of yourselves during this crazy time, and go out and give yourself a big ol' orgasm, or better yet, give somebody else one.
What are we doing, man? What are we doing?
No, you're done.